Lawmakers have grilled the CEOs of Facebook, Twitter, and Google over how they moderate content on their platforms. The Senate Commerce Committee called Wednesday's hearing to discuss a law known as Section 230, which protects social media companies from liability for content published by its users. But Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey, and Sundar Pichai also face some questions from Democrats and Republicans on other topics, such as misinformation on their platforms, specifically surrounding the election. For more on this, I want to bring in Stephen Overly. He's a technology reporter for Politico. Stephen, good to have you with us. So what are some of the changes that lawmakers on both sides of the aisle want to see when it comes to Section 230?
Well, today's hearing was very heavy on politics, but very light on policy. We actually didn't hear a lot of substantive discussion about actual changes these lawmakers want to see made to Section 230. But we do know that there's bipartisan support for those changes, and we've seen more than a half dozen legislative proposals put forward in Congress, and there isn't really bipartisan support yet pushing any one path forward. Interestingly, though, we have heard both President Donald Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden say they want to see this law repealed. So no matter who wins the election next week, it's very likely that this law remains contentious for a while to come.
Stephen, if that law were repealed, and I think that this goes to the heart of what you were saying before, that there isn't an easy replacement in terms of how these entire systems have been built for these platforms to continue to exist if the big companies are in fact responsible for misinformation or disinformation that's published to their site. So how likely is it that following this election that either party, if they're in control, will actually be able to do away with 230?
Well, you raise an excellent point. Everyone agrees that this law has been essential for companies like Facebook, Twitter, and Google to get started. The question is, now that they're so big and so powerful, does this law need to be revisited? And there's no clear answer yet on what to do with that. I think a lot of lawmakers are worried that if you do scrap this law entirely, that could put some of these big tech companies in a very vulnerable position. It could also put small tech companies in a very vulnerable position, those who do not have the big budgets or the legal departments that you might find at Facebook and Google, for instance. But there are some discussions about whether this law should just be amended, perhaps make it narrower or require that these tech companies clear a higher bar in order to get those legal protections. So folks are coming at this in different ways. And as I said, there really is not a clear path forward yet, in part because if you get rid of this law, you do have to figure out how you're going to replace it.
And that's a sticky wicket, right? All right, so the big three were also questioned, of course, about the spread of disinformation on their respective platforms. Did you hear any solutions being offered up or plans on how they really intend to address the issue? We heard them all say, of course, they are opposed to misinformation and disinformation. They're looking out for it. But did you hear a lot of substance in terms of what they're intending to do to stop it?
This hearing really was light on substance. And so one thing we heard them say time and again, and this is a line that these companies have repeated before, they're really making an effort to serve up credible information so that when you log into Twitter or you log into Facebook, you're immediately presented with accurate information about how to vote or when we might expect election results. And the reason they say that's critical is because there's a lot of confusion around this election due to coronavirus, due to some statements from the president regarding mail-in voting. And as a result, they expect that their users will have a lot more questions about this whole electoral process this year. And so they're trying to serve that up so that they're not presented with misinformation that could be deceptive. The other thing these companies have talked about is sort of how they label content or try to remove content if it is in fact misleading and could go viral. But as we saw in the hearing today, that's politically risky for these companies. If they take down content or penalize content, inevitably they're going to get blowback from Democrats and often Republicans, sort of accusing them of interfering in the political process themselves. And that kind of becomes a no-win situation for these companies.
Well, one quick question for you. Speaking of blowback, Democrats were criticizing Republicans for holding this hearing so close to Election Day. Is there something behind the timing?
Well, we are 6 days away from Election Day, and Democrats are sort of accusing Republicans of essentially trying to play the refs. They know there will be a lot of information and misinformation that floods onto these networks ahead of the election. And some of that could be helpful to President Trump. And they sort of are accusing Senate Republicans of essentially politicizing this process and trying to convince these companies, or really scare these companies, not to moderate some of that content. They say this should be a nonpartisan process because both parties should be invested in sort of the sanctity of the election. But the reality is we heard a lot of divisive politics during today's hearing. And I think you'll see that continue to play out between now and Election Day, if not beyond.
Yeah, all right. Stephen Overly, thank you.
Thank you.